Hello, everyone. Welcome to my channel. My name is. Welcome, everybody. My name is Christopher Donald. Welcome to my channel, and I'm going to be doing a ceramics demo on making a slab-built cylinder and altering a slab-built cylinder. So, start off with working on a piece of heavy duck canvas. This is #1 duck canvas, which is the same material they use for making like belts. And I like working on this rather than like a hard board because it's a little bit easier to clean. It does give me a coarse texture on my pieces, but I'm going to show you some tricks for removing that or getting rid of it if that's not what you like. First off, I'm going to wedge my clay. This is reclaimed clay, meaning it's been used for other things already. And so I'm going to have to kind of mix it up a little bit and make sure that it's well blended. When I'm mixing clay, I often do spiral wedging. I find it's a little bit easier to kind of be more aggressive with the wedging and to get it mixed a bit better. And then once I've got it mixed up good, I can switch to ram's head. I'll often go back and forth between the two of them while I'm trying to mix clay. All right. This is slab building or hand building, so it doesn't matter 100% if the moisture content is perfect on this clay. Rolling it out is very different than throwing it on the wheel. You're not going to notice little differences in moisture the same way. So I'm going to ram's head wedge the clay, and then I'm going to flatten it on end. Doing this is going to give me different layers of compression because the two ends of the ram's head were spirals and the center is compressed. And especially when I'm making slabs, I really want to make sure that my clay is well compressed and that that grain is more like plywood. So I'm going to start flattening this out. And while I'm flattening it, I'm also going to think about what shape am I really going for here. So I'm going to be making an elongated slab. So I'm not going to actually start with a round piece. I'm going to let it be elongated to begin with. Get it down to about 3/4 of an inch. And I'll use my rolling pin. A nice large rolling pin here. For anyone who doesn't know this, it's best not to wash rolling pins to clean them. I usually just use a metal rib and scrape it. And I just used this a little earlier to prep for the demo, so I clean that off. And you're not going to ever want to use your rolling pin as a mallet. Notice I used my fist for actually spreading this clay out a little bit. I didn't use the rolling pin. Really bad for the rolling pin. Ruins the bearings in them. If it's a solid shaft or if it doesn't actually turn, I guess it doesn't matter. But these ones with the metal bearings, that's a good way of wrecking your nice expensive rolling pin. Okay, and I'm making sure that I'm flipping and turning this clay as I roll it out. I want to compress it from a lot of different directions if I can. There we go. And I'm going for about 1/4 of an inch, maybe a little bit thinner. This is going to be a mug, so I don't want it to be too thick, but I also don't want it to be too thin. It's easy with hand building to make things a little on the thin side. If I want, I can use rolling sticks, meaning I could put a piece of wood on either side of this, and then that would help me establish that it's an even thickness all the way across. So I would unstick this towards the end and then just roll the slab with my rolling pin, bridging the sticks. I'm pretty confident that I'm rolling these correctly, so not really going to bother. And then another nice little trick is if you're not sure what size or what length of slab you're going to need to make a cylinder, I like to roll a little coil. And then I can use this coil to kind of estimate how big of a cylinder do I want. And then that tells me how long I need. So don't have to have this extra clay all dry out, although I'm going to want some of this for the bottom. Right, so I know that's going to be my length. And then I want to make sure I'm cutting this square. One nice way of doing that is with like a triangle. So I can set that on one edge and run my ruler on the other edge, on the long edge. There you go. And then that way I know I'm making a nice square cut. If you're trying to make a straight cylinder, it's good if you can start with something that's straight. All right, go ahead and set this end. And I'm using a fettling knife. It is not actually sharp. If you're using a knife to cut on canvas, make sure you've sanded the edge so that it doesn't have any real sharpness to it. It does not require a razor sharp tool to cut soft clay like this. But I prefer using a flat cutter to a pin tool. Pin tools tend to kind of move a little bit as you're pulling them through the clay, and the flat won't do that. I'm going to set this piece aside. I'm going to use that for a bottom. And this piece here, I'm going to compress it with a metal rib. So I'm going to compress this with a metal rib. And I like to use a metal rib because I can put a lot more force on this fine edge and actually kind of really compress it and not just smooth it. But I wouldn't mind having a nice fine texture on this when I'm done. So I'm going to go ahead and move this slab onto a bed sheet, which doesn't share the same coarse tooth as the heavy canvas. And then when I compress this other side, it won't leave those heavy canvas marks on the back. And I'm compressing the front. If you get any little air bubbles, you can pop those with a pin tool at this point. Go. And I'm doing this from multiple directions. So since the idea is to compress and not to smooth, I want to make sure I'm compressing from multiple directions, and smoothing is basically a byproduct of compression. I can re-square up the ends here because I pressed hard enough that I actually moved the clay a little. It's good. Means I'm doing it right. And this is going to be left as just a cylinder. So this top edge is going to be the drinking edge. And I'm going to go ahead and compress that with the edge of my hand. So that kind of rounds that off a little bit for me without me having to do too much work with it later on. Now, what I recommend is that at this point, this clay is pretty soft, and it's actually a little bit too soft to be putting the seam together. So what I recommend that you do is you overlap the seam and just let this sit for a little bit. Depending on how fast things are drying, I might just let it air dry for like an hour. This will set up a little bit. It won't be leather hard, but it'll be like early leather hard. And then I can put the seam together a lot cleaner than I can later on. Also, this is a good point to mark my slab that I'm going to use for a bottom, because this clay is still pretty soft. So if I can get rid of the excess, I want to do it now while I can just wedge it back up rather than waiting until this whole thing is leather hard and having a big chunk of leather hard clay that I have to then wedge into something, or I have to wrap it up and rehydrate it later. So it's actually better if I can figure out approximately how big this needs to be now. The way I like to do that is I just kind of wipe a little bit of water on the bottom edge of this, and then I'm just going to touch it down. There we go, onto the slab. I said this is on the soft side, but it's enough that it leaves a mark. And I don't have to cut right to the mark, but I'll cut like a quarter of an inch, a half inch outside of that mark. And then that way, I know it's big enough. I've got a little extra, but all this can get squished up now while it's soft, and I'm not going to waste so much. A lot better for the long term. All right, so I would let both of these kind of set up for a little bit before putting them together. In the interests of demo, I'm going to go ahead and cut and assemble the seam now. I can do it. I'm pretty comfortable working with the clay this soft, but I'm much more likely to have good results if I just let this air dry for a little bit. That being said, while these two pieces are overlapped, I'm going to cut through both parts, both walls, at a 45-degree angle at the same time. It's kind of like cutting a pumpkin lid. It makes it so that even if my cut isn't even, it's still going to line up perfectly because they were cut at the same time. It ends up being an absolutely identical line to put together. I'm going to take my scoring tool here, support the wall a little bit, again, because this is fairly soft. And then I'm going to score both edges, do it, add water, do it again. You want this to be a soft connection when you put these together. You don't want either one of these to be on the dry side. When I put this together, I want there to be a little bit of a squish, and I want to see a little bit of slip come out. Now, I'm not actually going to line this wall up, perfectly like this. I'm going to offset it so that it's more like that. So this side of the wall is sticking out a little bit past this side of the wall. What that does is that if I start like this, or figure out how to get my hands to actually do the thing that the clay is doing. So if I start off so that a little bit is sticking out, as I'm putting pressure here to put the wall together, it's going to slide into place and then they'll be flush. If I Hi, I'm Christopher Donald. Thanks for joining me on my channel. And I'm going to be doing part 2 of altering or making slab built cylinders with hand building. And for the previous video, I did just a straight walled cylinder with a bottom, nice and simple. And for this, I want to take a straight sided cylinder and do some darting to it. So darting is a process that you use in textiles. Where I remove wedges of the clay, and then I can shape it depending on which pieces I'm taking out. So first off, I'm going to go ahead and paddle this seam. This was formed, allowed to sit for about an hour, and now is at a good point that I can do my finishing on it. So it's a lot stiffer. It can put up with a little bit of abuse. I can paddle that seam nice and flat. I can take off any remaining high points with a Surform rasp. And then I can use a metal tool to compress this one more time and make sure that seam is nice and clean and compressed and strong. Nice and smooth and compressed. All right. My trick is I look down on the pieces from above if I want to make them round. It's much easier to see than if you're looking at it like this way. And so this is good to go. Now I'm going to take some pieces out of it that will help me change the shape. The simplest one is to take out edge darts. So I usually take out the first one where the seam is, because then I'm just doing a seam on top of a seam. And you can space these any way you want. Generally, you're just using them to help you taper the clay. So it kind of depends on what final shape you're going for. I'm going to try and taper this kind of more symmetrically. So I'm just going to put 3 of them in here. If I wanted to make it so that it was tapered in a specific direction, like flatten it or something, I might put in 2 darts. I could square it, put in 4 darts. So that's kind of up to you. I'm going to use my scratching tool, scoring tool, to make sure that I'm scoring these seams really, really well. And I don't need to overthink making this cut. Make it straight through the wall. If you make it straight, when you put it together, they'll actually meet up with each other perfectly. Don't worry about trying to angle those cuts when you do your darting. I go around once, and then I go around one more time, adding a little bit more water just to make sure that when I put these together, they're nice and soft. That connection needs to be soft. If, as I'm putting these together, I notice that it's dried, I would stop and score it again before finishing to put it together. This clay is on the stiff side, so I'm kind of helping ease it together by wiggling it a little bit. As well as pushing, I'm wiggling. Get that connected. And this one, I'm going to push and wiggle. And the wiggling is going to help that clay kind of ease into place without it cracking. Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. There we go. Right here at the top, it has a tendency to want to come apart. If it does that, I'm just going to get in there with some water and my scoring tool and score it again. And make sure I've got a really nice little wet, squishy connection. This is already dried out. I need to rescore this and add more water before I put it together, or that's going to fail. All right, now I can go ahead and get this together, wiggling and pushing. All right, there we go. Now, if I mess with this at this point, this is going to fail. So the most I'm going to want to do is maybe compress a little bit under and on either side of the seam. But I am not going to want to do much to put undue pressure on it. It needs to kind of have a few minutes for that wet part to even out. And I can check, like here, I've got a little bit of my wall kind of came apart because I put so much pressure. I'm going to go ahead and reach in there with my scoring tool, add a little bit of water, score that really good, push that back together again, and similar to those seams, leave it. I would let all of this air dry or basically sit wrapped up. If I leave it with moving air, then the rest of it's going to continue to dry as well. And I kind of want the rest of this pot to be pulling the moisture from these seams rather than all of that air drying and shrinking while these are also trying to dry. So I'm going to wrap this up. And once it's had a little bit of time to set, I'm going to come back and we're going to finish the demo. All right, I'll see you in a couple minutes. Hi, welcome back. I've let this set up a little bit. I kept it wrapped up while it was setting so that these seams will be a little bit more durable now. And what I'm going to do is start by supporting it from the other side with my finger. And then I'm going to paddle these more into the shape that I want them to be. So I'm basically gradually working these points down using a paddle because it's going to do an even pressure and allow me to compress it and reshape it, but without having to remove any material necessarily right away. If I can, I'd like to get this as close as possible without having to actually scrape any of this off. And that's because it'll keep my seam a little bit stronger. I've got a little bit of a divot here. Rather than scraping that, I'm actually going to fill that in a second. Now, if the clay is a little bit softer, it's easier to manipulate this, and it's going to be easier to make it so that it bends and doesn't leave any kinds of like lines or folds or anything. But the downside of it being softer is that you might kind of warp more of it than you want to. The downside of it being too stiff is that some of your seams might still open up a little bit while you're compressing it. So you kind of got to walk a fine line with this one. Sometimes it'll be easier to do it a little softer, sometimes a little bit stiffer. Either one is fine. If you have anything open up on you, you're going to use some water. Get in there with your scoring tool and make sure that you score that really good. And you want a nice soft connection again. Seams coming apart, problems with cracking, they're not really that big of an issue as long as you're kind of addressing them and patching things correctly. I'm going to go ahead and paddle this with the edge of the paddle for a little bit more force and kind of massage that seam back together again, going kind of back and forth with it. It's pretty stiff clay, so I can hit it fairly hard at this point to compress it back together. And I'll do the same thing here. Wiggling to put it back together, holding it in place, and then helping to compress this seam with the edge of my paddle for a little bit more force. Then the flat. There we are. And it's looking pretty good. I'm going to score this one a little bit more too, just for the heck of it. Okay. Now before I start cleaning this up anymore, I'm going to take and flatten the top. I've got some raised pieces where I'm putting this together. And I'm going to use a surform and just kind of plane that down. And I can take off part of where the seams are, because that's going to be fairly weak. Make sure I get it nice and flat. And paddle it that way as well. If I've got seams on the inside here that I want to deal with, the best thing to do is to just compress them. There should be a little bit of extra material there. And you can use, let's see what a good tool is for this. Even something like a chopstick. You basically want something kind of round that you can get in there and compress it, and it doesn't dig into the sides of the walls. So if it's an inside curve, that's usually going to be something rounded, like a pencil or a chopstick. Another thing that I could use in here is a spoon. Those work really well for that inside compression. And if I have a lot of this kind of seam that I want to clean up, I can use a decorative clay slip. And when this is all assembled, I can just pour in slip to coat up all of the seams and then pour it back out again, just like I'm glazing, but doing it with slip. If you want it to match the clay body so that you can't even tell that you used decorative slip to line it, then you just make up a slip out of all your little scrap materials and line it with itself. It's a great way of cleaning up seams with a minimal amount of effort. This is a spoon that I've actually sharpened, so I can use it for scraping. One side I can scrape, the other side I can burnish. Spoons are ideal for cleaning up hand-built pieces. Right, I'm going to look from the top here and make sure I've got this nice and round. As it gets stiffer, I want to make sure I'm keeping that round. And then I can double check the outside, make sure all of my long seam is all cleaned up correctly, compressed. All right, and now if I have any little bits that I've decided I can actually clean that off a little bit with a scraper. It wasn't so deep that I actually needed to fill it. I'm okay with that. I'll just scrape it off real fast. Very small amount, so then I can use my metal rib again as like a scraper to remove the marks from my surform. And then after this, I could use a rubber rib. And again, if anything, I've got one little seam here that keeps wanting to open up on me, and that's okay. I'm just going to use my tool, get down inside there, add a little bit of water, press it back together again. Just keep closing, keep compressing. It'll probably stop opening on me once I put the bottom on. It'll be something to kind of hold that collar a little bit better. All right. Yeah, I'm going to actually leave cleaning that up anymore until I'm ready to put the bottom on and clean up the bottom. All right, so those are bottom darts. So I can taper the bottom. And let me go ahead and show putting the bottom on. What I like to do is take a little bit of water and I just rub that on the bottom of the foot of the wall where I'm going to want to mark the bottom clay. And then I just press it on there, wiggle it, pull it off. That's going to leave a mark. That shows me where I need to score. So I don't have to score too much. If I score too much, then I have a lot more I need to clean up on the inside. This way I don't have to worry about that. This clay is medium late leather hard. It's not quite getting dusty on the edges for like late leather hard, but it's fairly stiff. So it's going to take a little bit of water and scoring and then water and then scoring in order for me to have a nice slip for these two pieces to get stuck together. You don't want to put these together unless you have a nice, soft, wet connection. Okay? So I come back and score this again because the body of the piece, this bottom had dried out a little. Check them both before I put them together. Look down from the top so I can line it up on the foot. A little bit of vibration. And then I like to use the paddle to get a good connection there. Then I'm going to dome this in. I want a little bit concave. This is so stiff. I'm going to go ahead and just trim this flush now. I really don't want this to dry much more before I go cleaning it up. So I'm going to go ahead and trim my excess off. Once your clay scrap is leather hard like this, it's a lot harder to recycle. This you would want to wrap in like a wet towel overnight, and that will soften it up really easily. If you want, you can slake it all the way down to a liquid and then reclaim it by putting it on plaster slabs or something like that. But the less of the total liquefaction of the clay you need to do, the less work it'll take to recycle it. So if you're going to recycle or reclaim that clay, try and do it in a way that involves the least amount of effort. Now that I can kind of see this a bit more, I'll give it a little bit more compression, and I can compress it from the side too. There we go. If I feel like there's a little bit extra that I want to take off, I'll do it with the Surform. And then I will scrape it with my metal rib. There we go. And I'm going to do a separate video on adding a foot to a hand-built piece. This one's getting a little long, so we'll keep it a little bit shorter. On stiffer clay like this, I like using a blue rubber rib. It's softer, but it's still stiffer than a Cheryl red rib. So this is the Blue Kemper. I think this works really good for helping to burnish or clean up seams later on when the clay's a little bit stiffer. This will remove my scraper marks. There we go. Okay, make sure that's a little concave. I can use my thumb to do a final little bit of a smoothing on that edge, and then that's done. All right, now there's another type of dart that you can do, and that's a center dart. I left this one a little bit softer, so I can do a bit more on it as far as flexing it. So you saw with this that because the clay is a lot stiffer, I can only bend it so far. So this is still going to give me a little bit of kind of like an angular feel to it leading into the round. If I want it to be completely kind of blended together, I can do that when the clay is a little softer. So this seam has been put together, it's been allowed to sit, but I wrapped it up sooner than I did the other one, so the clay is not, it's barely early leather hard. It's got a lot of motion in it. So let's go ahead and do a couple different darts on this. I'm going to do a side dart, and a side dart is going to be more of like an eye shape. Start by making it narrower to begin with and see how much that allows you to bend the clay before you make it bigger. If that isn't enough to bend it as much as you want, then you can always make it bigger. Let's go ahead and do 3 on this one. If you need to know exactly how big or how much you're doing, you can keep one of the previous ones as a template, and you can put it on it in order to mark it or give you some idea of what size it is. Or you can wing it, either one, to your pot. It does not take much of a dart for these to come in. So make it smaller until you're more used to the amount that it's going to change it before you go making them really large. Work your way up to it. I'm going to score and slip, or score and add water to create slip here. And then I'm going to push these together. There we go. Get all three of them. And like I was mentioning earlier, this is a fabric or a textile technique for making garments. This is how you shape something so that it fits somebody's body a little bit better, is by darting. And ceramics lends itself to act like a lot of different materials. When it's stiffer, it acts like wood or stone. When it's softer, it can act like fabric. And the type of feeling that you get from it in the end is in many ways related to when in the process you're doing things. So if you're doing things when it's softer, you're going to get a softer feel. You're going to be able to move things a little bit more. If you're doing things when it's stiffer, then that's what you're going to get. So for this, I would probably use, I could use like a rounded dowel in order to get in the inside curve of this, but there's a couple ways to do it. I'm going to just show doing it with a standard paddle. I'm going to paddle the ends, and then I'm going to use the fine part, the edge of my paddle, to paddle inside the curve. And this is, I'm kind of going back and forth a little bit as I'm paddling, because it's not just about smoothing, it's about compressing the seam so that it'll hold together well. And I'm doing this while it's soft. With the other one, I did it when it was firmer. And you'll see the difference in that it's very easy to move the clay now. It's just stiff enough that it can hold itself up. But I can blend these seams really good. And I can make this much more organic feeling, much rounder than I can when the clay has been allowed to stiffen up. First, I'm going to compress them with the paddle. I'm actually even doing this before the seam has had a chance to fully dry, which is possible. You just have to have a delicate hand about it. Ideally, I would let this sit for at least 5 or 10 minutes before putting the seam together. But I do want to show that it's possible to do it this way too, and it will give you a slightly different feeling. Okay, once I've got those, I'm actually going to shift to a red rubber rib. I believe I have a Cheryl red here somewhere. There we go. Should clean my tools up for once so I know where things are. And I like the soft rib if the clay is soft like this, and I'm trying to kind of replicate the feeling of like one of my fingers and just very delicately blending that together. Support it from the other side for that side seam that I paddled closed before we started. I can compress any of these little wrinkles, and I can compress my seam. I am supporting it from the other side so that I'm not pushing straight in. And I'm concentrating on blending and compressing rather than just smoothing. So I'm trying to push the two sides of the seam together as I'm doing this to make sure I have a strong connection. That's the real driver here. All right, and then I can kind of readjust my top and my bottom, make sure things are round, and I'll continue to keep doing this as it dries, tweaking it into being round. I can then come back, and I'm going to do a little bit more of this at this stage, but frankly, it'd be better if I let this stiffen up just a little bit, and then I can finish tweaking this curve. When the clay is stiffer, more of the clay will move when you try and push on it. So when it's soft, I can push in a spot and a very small part of it will move. When it's stiffer, I could push in that same spot and a lot more of it will move. So if I'm trying to do something even, I want to do it later in the process if I can, because then it's going to move more evenly rather than I push in a spot and it immediately moves just where my fingertip is. If I feel like there's more of the seam that I want to compress, I'm going to use my metal rib, kind of come back in, cleaning it off in between. I want it to slide nicely. And this clay is still pretty soft, so it's sticking to the rib a little bit. So I'll clean it off on my board, on my fabric here. So I get a nice sliding there. All right, now I could do a similar thing here with after I've done center darts. I could do edge darts like I did on the last one. And we'll do those opposite the other darts. And you can see what that gives you. And some of this you can mess around with paper and play around with just like what shapes you get by cutting paper and then taping the paper together. So start with like a cylinder of paper and then just see what darting is going to get you. It's a really nice way of kind of coming up with some ideas for how the folding works. Go ahead and score this, make sure there's a little bit of water. This clay is much wetter. I'm going to put them together as I go so that they have a chance to set for like a couple seconds at least as I move on to the next one. It also will ensure that they're not drying out as I move around. This will hopefully give me a better connection than if I do all three and then start putting them all together. Do them one at a time. Okay. There we go. And again, I'm just not going to wait. I'm going to go ahead and support it from the inside and sort of see what we get if I immediately start trying to put this seam together. Compressing it, blending it, making it strong. That's the goal. When I'm first putting it together, a little bit less about shaping and more about making sure that this is a strong seam. Pushing these two sides together back and forth, and then paddling it from the front. It's soft enough that I should be able to do this without there being really any lines or folds or anything left over at the end of the process. And you can see already that this is going to give me something much smoother, much rounder than the first one. It's all about intent. It's all about what feel do you want. As you get better at this, you should be able to make the things that you're intending and not just end up with, what you get is what you get kind of a thing. And instead of waiting for this to hit it with the surform when it's stiffer, I can use my knife, trim off this little bit of extra now, so it can at least sit flat, and I can finish refining it later once it's a little bit stiffer. I can get some of this off now. All right. So you can see I can significantly change what these shapes look like through this process of just darting it, folding it, paddling it. It takes a little bit of patience. But that's a really nice range of different shapes. And you can start combining these. You start thinking about like, well, what if I stack them on top of each other? What if I use one as a base? Didn't fit too good. Oh, I made him a lot bigger. But, what if I start putting them on top of each other? I can make things like bottles, much larger containers, vases. So you can work modularly as well. But I just wanted to go over a couple of these transformation techniques. Often these kind of get glossed over and people are learning how to do hand building. So thanks for joining me. And I'll be doing a video soon on how to add a foot onto the bottom of your hand-built pieces. Give them a little bit more lift if you want. All right? Take care. Remember to subscribe so you get notified if I have any new videos, and I'll see you soon.